40,000 dead in 4 hours. It is a figure the human brain cannot process, but the Ionian Sea had to do it. At dawn on the 7th of October in the year 1571, the waters off Greece were blue and deep. By noon, they were a thick soup of splintered wood floating turbans and blood, so much blood that the waves broke red against the hulls of the galleys. It was a tectonic clash. Islam against Christendom, the Ottoman Empire against a desperate and fragile alliance called the Holy League. 200 Christian galleys against nearly 300 Turkish ships. If the Christian line breaks today, there will be no tomorrow for Rome, nor for Venice, nor for Vienna. The Mediterranean will become an Ottoman lake, and the cross will be torn from the domes of Europe. But before the first cannon fires, before the water boils from the artillery, one must understand why these men are here, ready to kill each other with a ferocity the ancient world had never seen. The rage that drives the Christian rowers does not come from patriotism, it comes from terror. And that terror has a name, Famagusta. Months before this dawn on the island of Cyprus, the Venetian fortress of Famagusta fell after a brutal siege. The Venetians surrendered under the promise of safe passage, a code of military honor respected for centuries. But the Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa, wanted no honor, he wanted to send a message. The Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin was mutilated. They cut off his ears and nose while he was still alive. But that was not enough to quench the hatred. They flayed him alive, tearing his skin centimeter by centimeter in an agony that lasted hours, then stuffed that skin with straw. They dressed the macabre dummy in his uniform and paraded it on a cow through the camp. That image, the straw-stuffed skin of a Christian general, haunts every sailor of the Holy League this morning. They know there is no possible negotiation. They know surrender is a sentence to slow and atrocious death. Today, in the Gulf of Lepanto, the only option is total victory or absolute annihilation. Yet there is a tactical anomaly in the Christian formation that should guarantee their defeat. On paper, the Holy League is a logistical disaster. It is made up of Spaniards, Venetians, and papal forces who hate each other more than they hate the Turk. Weeks earlier, in the port of Messina, Spanish and Venetian soldiers were killing each other with knives in the streets while waiting to sail. The admirals shouted, threatening to withdraw their ships and go home. How is it possible that this fleet, riddled with envy and internal distrust, managed to reach here in perfect battle formation? The answer lies not in military logic, but in the will of a single man, a 24-year-old who has never commanded a fleet in his life. His name is Don John of Austria. He is the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V, half-brother of the King of Spain, Philip II. A young man with royal blood, but no crown, desperate to prove he is worth more than his surname. When the old Venetian admirals, men with decades of sea behind them, suggested caution and defense, Don John slammed the table. His order was suicidal and simple: seek out the Ottoman fleet and attack it wherever it was. Without accurate maps, without knowing the exact number of the enemy, Don John forced the alliance to sail into the wolf's mouth. On the other side of the water, the Ottoman admiral Ali Pasha watches the horizon. He has numerical superiority. He has the wind in his favor. He has the janissaries, the deadliest infantry in the world, with loaded arquebuses and sharpened scimitars. Ali Pasha is a man who has never known total defeat. The Mediterranean is his backyard, but Ali makes a fatal mistake at this precise moment. His spies had told him the Christian fleet was small, sick, and divided. They told him Don John would not dare leave port so late in the year with winter approaching. But when the morning mist lifts near the Curzolari Islands, Ali Pasha sees the impossible. He does not see a small fleet. He sees a wall of wood and sails stretching from coast to coast. The Christian fleet did not stay home, it has come to find him. And here arises the great mystery of the morning. Upon seeing the magnitude of the enemy fleet, Ali Pasha's advisors beg him to withdraw. They are in friendly waters. They can retreat to the safety of their coastal fortresses and wait. Fighting in open sea against an equal force is an unnecessary gamble. The empire does not need this battle to survive. So why does Ali Pasha order the advance? Why does he accept the challenge instead of wearing down the enemy over time? To understand this decision that will doom thousands, one must look at a secret order resting in the admiral's pocket. A letter sent from Istanbul signed by Sultan Selim II, the Sultan. Far from the front, drunk on power and wine, understands nothing of naval tactics, only pride. The order is explicit, forbidden to avoid combat. The honor of the caliphate demands Christian blood. Ali Pasha, a brilliant tactician, is forced to act like a butcher by the political whim of his master. He knows the terrain is not ideal. He knows his Christian slave rowers are on the verge of rebellion, but court politics outweighs the reality of the sea. At 9 in the morning, the wind blows hard from the east. It pushes the Ottoman ships toward the Christians, giving them speed and momentum. For the Holy League, this is a catastrophe. They must row against the wind, exhausting their men before they cross swords. The Christian galleys advance slowly, heavily, struggling to hold the straight line. If the line breaks, the Turks will surround them and massacre them one by one. Don John of Austria stands on the bow of his flagship La Real. Beside him, the captains watch the empty limp sails lacking favorable wind. The silence is absolute. Only the creaking of wood and the gasping of rowers can be heard. They are sailing toward a head-on collision with the wind against them. It is a tactical death sentence. The gunners prepare their matches. The priests aboard give general absolution. They know physics is against them. But then, something happens that is not in the war manuals, something both Muslim and Christian chroniclers will remember with reverent fear. At 10 in the morning, when the fleets are only a few kilometers apart, the wind suddenly changes without warning. The easterly breeze dies, and within minutes, a new wind begins to blow from the west. The Ottoman sails deflate, their ships lose momentum. Their formation becomes disordered, and the Holy League's sails fill. The wind of God, shout the priests. The luck of the damned curse the Turks. Don John wastes no second. He orders full speed on the oars. Now it is the Holy League that charges the enemy. The bronze prows of the galleys cut the water like knives. There is no turning back. The two largest formations ever to sail the Mediterranean accelerate for impact. 6 strange vessels, larger and heavier than any normal galley, advance ahead of the Christian line. They are the Venetian galleys, floating fortresses bristling with cannons. The Turks have never seen anything like them in action. They think they are cargo ships, slow and clumsy. They approach confidently to board them. It is the first miscalculation of a day full of miscalculations. Ottoman commanders order their galleys to open and surround these giants, thinking they are easy prey. But when the Turkish ships are within stone's throw, the sides of the galleys open. They are not cargo ships. They are 360-degree artillery platforms. The first shot is not a cannon blast, it is a storm. The roar resembles nothing these men have ever heard. It is not the dry sound of an isolated shot. It is the continuous roar of a horizontal volcanic eruption. The 6 Venetian galleys unleash hell simultaneously. Their sides, packed with heavy artillery, sweep the sea. For the Ottoman vanguard galleys, the effect is apocalyptic. Cannonballs do not just pierce wood, they pulverize it. In an instant, entire ships become clouds of sharp splinters, flying like shrapnel, decapitating rowers and shattering masts. In less than 20 minutes, a third of the Turkish vanguard simply ceases to exist. They sink or become drifting, floating coffins. Ali Pasha's plan to surround the cargo ships has turned into a slaughter. The Ottoman formation, that perfect crescent that intimidated the world, breaks. Panic spreads. Turkish captains desperately turn to avoid the firing field of these floating monsters. But the chaos creates opportunities, and Ali Pasha, amid smoke and screams, makes a quick decision. He realizes the galleys are slow and heavy. Deadly, yes, but immobile as castles. He orders to ignore them. Pass them by, attack the main line, shout the officers. The surviving Turkish galleys accelerate, passing dangerously close to the Venetian monsters, accepting punishment to reach the true target. Don John's fleet. And then comes the collision. It is a dull, nauseating sound multiplied by hundreds. 200 Christian ships and 250 Turkish ships collide head-on at full speed. The Ionian Sea disappears beneath a continuous wooden platform. It is no longer a naval battle. It is a land battle fought on an unstable, blood-soaked surface. Bronze rams embed in enemy hulls, gangplanks drop, and thousands of men leap to board. But in this chaos of steel and screams, there is a technological difference that will decide who lives and who dies. A difference invisible to the naked eye, but lethal. The Ottomans rely on the composite bow. Their archers are precision machines, capable of firing 10 arrows per minute with deadly accuracy. They can darken the sun with their projectiles. The Christians, however, carry arquebuses, slow, heavy weapons that take an eternity to reload and often misfire. In theory, the Turkish archer should massacre the Spanish arquebusier before he can even fire a second time. Yet there is a macabre detail that changes the equation. The decks of the Christian galleys have high wooden parapets protecting their men. And most importantly, the majority of Spanish and German soldiers wear steel breastplates. Turkish arrows bounce off the metal chests like harmless rain. But when an arquebus fires, no Ottoman shield or mail stops it. Lead balls pierce flesh, bone, and wood. Ottoman rate of fire is high, but Christian damage is final. Every arquebus shot drops a man, while Christians advance covered in arrows that fail to kill them, looking like invincible steel porcupines. In the exact center of this madness, two men seek each other with their eyes. There is no general strategy anymore. Everything reduces to a personal duel. Don John of Austria, on La Real, searches for the green flag of Mecca, flying on the Sultana Ali Pasha's ship. It is an act of supreme arrogance. The two supreme commanders do not direct the battle from the rear. They go to ram each other. But just before the impact between the two colossi, Don John reveals a dirty trick, a technical modification no one understood days earlier in port. When his carpenters shortened the prows of the Christian galleys, many thought the young bastard was mad. The ram is the main weapon of a galley, the spear with which you sink the enemy. Removing it seemed suicide. Why mutilate your own ships before battle? The answer comes now, at 50 meters. By cutting the beak of the prow, the central cannon of La Real no longer has to aim high to avoid damaging its own ship. It can aim low, straight at the waterline, straight at flesh. Ali Pasha's Sultana charges to board with its ram intact, ready to smash the Christian vessel. But La Real waits until the last second and fires its main cannon point blank. The impact is devastating. The discharge tears through the Ottoman ship's bow, sweeping the main deck before the janissaries can leap. Mangled bodies fly through the air, but inertia is unstoppable. Despite the cannon shot, the Sultana crashes violently into La Real. The Turkish ram embeds deeply in the Christian wood, reaching almost to the fourth rowing bench. The ships lock together in a deadly embrace, and then from the smoke of the shot emerges the elite of the Ottoman Empire. The janissaries of the Sultan are warriors trained from childhood for one thing: to kill. They have no fear, they do not retreat. They leap onto La Real's deck, shouting the name of Allah. Don John draws his sword. He is on deck shoulder to shoulder with his men. He is no longer the admiral, he is one more soldier fighting for his life. Don John's personal guard and Ali Pasha's janissaries clash in the center of the locked ships, and while the center of the fight hangs by a thread, on the Christian right flank, a silent catastrophe occurs. The Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, one of Christendom's most experienced mariners, is doing something inexplicable. Instead of closing the line and fighting, he is sailing out to open sea, moving away from the battle, leaving a huge gap in the Christian formation. It is cowardice, it is betrayal. Seeing the gap open, the commander of the Turkish left wing, the cunning Ulugh Ali, smiles. He sees the open highway to the Christian rear, turns his ships, and charges full speed through the breach. If he succeeds, he can attack the Christian fleet from behind, and the battle will be over. The cross will be crushed between two fires. Everything now depends on a handful of ships that notice Doria's mistake and desperately turn to plug the hole. They are few outnumbered, 10 to 1, and on one of those ships, a young Spanish soldier, fever-sick, rises from his bunk in the hold. The captain orders him to stay below, that he is too weak to fight. But the young man refuses. He climbs to the deck, staggering face, pale and sweaty, and asks for a sword and a place in the line of greatest danger. His name is Miguel de Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes feels no pain, only impact. The arquebus shot hits his chest, but his breastplate holds. He rises, coughs blood, and keeps firing. Then another impact, this time in the left hand. The lead shatters nerves and bones, leaving the hand useless forever, hanging like dead flesh. But on the deck of La Marquesa, no one stops to help him. There is no time for pity when the line is crumbling. The disaster on the right flank is no accident. It is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The Turkish commander of that sector, Uluj Ali, is no high-born noble like the others. He is a corsair, a pirate turned admiral. He knows the sea better than anyone. He saw that Gian Andrea Doria was a technician obsessed with naval geometry, so he set a trap. Uluj feigned sailing south, threatening to outflank the Christian fleet from outside. Doria, terrified of being flanked, took the bait and sailed parallel, moving farther and farther from the battle's center. It was a game of mirrors. Doria stretched the Christian line until it broke. At the exact moment, Uluj makes a 90-degree turn, stops sailing south, and charges like a shark toward the gap Doria just created. Doria tries to turn, but it is too late. His heavy ships cannot pivot as fast as the corsair galleys. The Christian flank is open. Uluj Ali's target is clear and personal, the flagship of Malta. The Knights of Malta are Islam's sworn enemies, religious fanatics clad in black steel. Uluj wants their heads. 7 Turkish galleys surround the solitary Maltese ship. It is a wolf pack against a wounded bear. The fight is primitive. No shots, only axes, swords, and fire. 300 knights defend their ship. 300 die. Not one remains standing to surrender. When the smoke clears momentarily, the Christians see with horror the unthinkable, the standard of St. John. The sacred banner of the order has been torn from the mast. Now it hangs upside down on Uluj Ali's ship. It is a devastating moral blow. The right flank is collapsing. If Uluj turns toward the center now, he will catch Don John from behind, and the battle will end. Meanwhile, in the center, the situation defies the laws of physics. Don John's La Real and Ali Pasha's Sultana have been locked together for an hour, immobile, turned into a single floating platform of death. How is it possible that after an hour of hand-to-hand combat with thousands dead, neither ship has fallen? The answer lies in the logistics of blood. Behind each flagship is a tail of smaller galleys acting as arteries. Every time a Spanish soldier falls dead on La Real's deck, another leaps from the ship behind to take his place. The same happens on the Turkish side. It is a conveyor belt of fresh meat. Men die, but the ship's complement never diminishes. It is a technical stalemate sustained by infinite sacrifice. Don John is covered in blood not his own. He has been wounded in the foot, but adrenaline cancels the pain. In front of him, only meters of blood-soaked wood away, Ali Pasha directs his archers. But the Ottoman admiral has a problem. He's running out of ammunition. The Janissaries fire so fast that arrows run out. Desperate, Ali Pasha begins throwing gold coins, oranges, any solid object, hurling them at the Christians like stones. It is the gesture of a man who sees the end. Yet the stalemate breaks not by valor but by a miscalculation in the Ottoman rear. The Christian reserves, commanded by the Marquis of Santa Cruz, have been watching the chaos. Santa Cruz is a cold, calculating veteran. He sees the center is stalled and the right flank crumbling. He must choose where to send reinforcements. If he saves the right flank, he loses the center. If he helps the center, Uluj could kill them all from behind. It is the hardest decision of the afternoon. Santa Cruz ignores the right flank, ignores the dead Maltese, orders his reserve galleys straight to the stern of La Real, injecting 200 fresh elite arquebusiers into the meat grinder at once. The balance of forces shifts violently. The wave of Spanish steel pushes the Janissaries back centimeter by centimeter to the Sultana's mast. An anonymous Spanish soldier, whose identity history barely remembers, sees his chance. He does not attack the soldiers. He fights his way through the elite guard, climbs the smoking rigging and leaps onto the man wearing the silk turban and brocade cloak. Ali Pasha, the Lion of the Sea, the man who never lost, looks up and sees steel falling upon him. There is no final duel, no last words. An axe blow severs his neck. The supreme Ottoman commander's head rolls across the deck. The soldier lifts it dripping and runs to the stern. Seconds later, Ali Pasha's head is impaled on a pike and raised above the smoke for the entire fleet to see. A strange, supernatural silence sweeps the Turkish line. The brain of the fleet is dead, but the body keeps fighting, and what comes next is not surrender. It is uncontrolled massacres driven by panic. Ali's head on the pike is not just a macabre trophy, it is a switch. The moment the Ottoman banners fall from the Sultana, and the Holy League flag rises on the mainmast, the psyche of the Turkish army breaks. For an Ottoman soldier, the death of his supreme commander is a divine sign. Allah has turned his back. Panic spreads faster than fire. Neighboring galley captains, seeing their flagship fall, cut anchor cables and order retreat. But panic at sea is deadly. Trying to turn and flee, Turkish galleys collide with each other. Blocked passages become a static, vulnerable mass. And then comes the second disaster for the empire, one born from the very bowels of their ships. For hours, 15,000 Christian slaves have been chained to the rowing benches of the Turkish fleet. They rowed under the whip, powering the ships, attacking their own brothers in faith. They have heard shouts of Santiago and victory above their heads. They know who is winning and know this is their only chance. It happens simultaneously on dozens of ships. It is the largest and most desperate naval rebellion in history. The slaves, emaciated and beaten, pull their chains with hysterical strength. They rip rivets from rotten wood. They use the iron shackles themselves as weapons. They attack their overseers from behind, biting, strangling, striking with chain fragments. The Ottoman fleet self-destructs from within. Janissaries on deck suddenly fight on two fronts, against boarding Spaniards and against slaves emerging from hatches like freed demons. The Ionian Sea changes color. Chroniclers will later say it is not a metaphor. The blood of 30,000 men dyes the water an oxide red so dense that wave foam turns pink. Bodies float so tightly packed that in some places one can walk from ship to ship without wetting one's feet. But the battle is not over. There is still a predator loose. On the right flank, Uluj Ali, the cunning corsair, sees his admiral's flag fall in the center. He instantly understands the arithmetic of defeat. The center is lost. The left is annihilated. He is the only one left with an intact fighting force. Any other commander would charge in suicidal vengeance for his leader. But Uluj Ali is no martyr. He is a survivor. He makes a cold, calculated decision. He will not save the battle. He will save himself and incidentally save the Sultan's honor to avoid execution upon returning home. He has the captured banner of the Knights of Malta in his hold. That piece of cloth is his safe conduct. He orders his ships to turn, but it is not so simple. To escape, he must cross behind the Christian line now closing on him. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, having saved the center, sees the corsairs maneuver. He turns his blood-soaked ships to intercept. A frantic chase begins. Uluj Ali orders his captains to cut the tows of captured Christian ships. He abandons the booty. He abandons the slowest ships of his own squadron. He sacrifices his men to gain speed. It is a race against death. Uluj Ali's galleys fly over the water. Whips crack on rowers' backs until they flay them. Santa Cruz fires his bow cannons, raising geysers of water meters from the corsair's stern. Uluj escapes by a hair, disappearing over the horizon with barely 13 galleys of the nearly 300 that arrived that morning. He leaves hell on earth behind. As the sun begins to lower, the sound of cannon ceases, replaced by far more terrible sound, the lament of thousands of shipwrecked men drowning. The water is full of men clinging to timbers, barrels, and swollen corpses. Don John of Austria walks the deck of La Real. The euphoria of victory fades at seeing the price. His ship is shattered, full of holes and dead. But then urgent news reaches him, not about the enemy, but about one of his own. Amid the carnage, they find the soldier who led the boarding, the young man who demanded to fight despite fever. Miguel de Cervantes is alive, but barely. His left hand is a bloody mess. The ship's surgeon looks and shakes his head. There's no way to save the hand. But as the surgeon prepares his sores, a black storm begins forming in the sky. The weather that gave them victory in the morning now threatens to drown the survivors in the afternoon. The battle ended at 4 in the afternoon, but death did not. Just as the last cannon falls silent, the sky over Greece opens. It is no ordinary rain. It is a biblical deluge, accompanied by lightning that illuminates a sea-turned cemetery. The Holy League's victory risks becoming a mass shipwreck. The victorious ships are full of holes, with splintered masts and bilge pumps clogged by blood and viscera. If they stay in open sea, the storm will finish what Turkish artillery began. Don John orders immediate refuge in the port of Petala. It is a procession of ghosts. The galleys crawl toward the coast, towing each other, creaking like wounded animals. As night falls under the precarious protection of the bay, the second act of this tragedy begins the reckoning. And here the reality of war hits harder than any heroic speech. Exhausted, soaked, shivering soldiers begin looting captured ships and discover something strange. The corpses of Ottoman officers and janissaries weigh too much. When cut open with knives, not only blood flows, but gold. Thousands of gold coins. It turns out the Sultan's soldiers did not trust leaving their wealth at home. They feared if they died, imperial officials would confiscate their goods from their families. So they carried their fortune on them, sewn into the linings of their silk caftans. For the Holy League survivors, this is sudden fever. Men who an hour earlier prayed for their souls now fight to tear clothes from the dead. The wealth changing hands that night is incalculable, but there is a treasure more valuable than gold in those foul holds. From the bows of captured Turkish galleys, skeletal figures begin emerging. They are the Christian rowers. 15,000 men lived chained to a wooden bench, sleeping in their own excrement, eating rotten bread. Whipped day after day. Many had not stood upright for years. That night, the loudest sound in the camp is not victory toasts, but the metallic clang of hammers and chisels breaking shackles. 15,000 souls regain freedom in a single night. They weep, kiss their liberator's feet, try to embrace Don John as he inspects the troops. It is a scene of absolute redemption amid hell. Yet Don John has no time for sentiment. He has an urgent logistical problem. He has thousands of living Turkish prisoners, and his men's hatred is uncontrollable. The Venetians, remembering the flayed general in Famagusta, want to execute every captured Ottoman. Blood for blood. Don John steps in. He knows a massacre of prisoners would stain his victory before history and before God. But there is an exception. Among the captured are Ali Pasha's sons, the dead admiral's teenagers, empire princes. They tremble, awaiting execution. Don John does something that surprises everyone. He treats them as noble guests, gives them his own clothes, seats them at his table. It is a gesture of medieval chivalry in a modern, brutal war. But the gesture hides cold strategy. Don John knows these boys are worth more alive than dead. They are chess pieces for coming negotiations. But while booty is divided in Petala, on the sea, a solitary ship races toward Istanbul at full speed. It carries news Sultan Selim II never expected to hear. The empire has lost. The invincible fleet is floating wood. The question now is not how to celebrate, but what will happen when the most powerful man in the Islamic world learns his invincible armada has been erased from the map. Will he accept defeat, or will the Sultan's wrath unleash even worse revenge? The news travels faster than the wind. Chronicles say Pope Pius V knew before any ship arrived. He was handling financial affairs in the Vatican when suddenly he rose, opened a window and stared at the sky in silence for minutes. He turned to his treasurers and said, "Leave the accounts. Go give thanks to God because our fleet has just won the victory." When the official messenger arrives days later, salt-crusted and exhausted, he confirms the vision. Rome explodes. It is not celebration, it is delirium. Bells of every church ring at once. Cannons from Castel Sant'Angelo. Fire salutes until powder runs out. The weeping pope quotes the gospel with a play on words that will remain in history. Fuit homo missus a Deo qui nomen erat Ioannes. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Don John of Austria is elevated to holy warrior status. But while Europe gets drunk on triumph, across the Mediterranean in Topkapi Palace, something happens that chills Western spies' blood. Sultan Selim II receives news of the disaster. His first reaction is visceral. He orders executions of every Christian in the empire, hundreds of thousands of innocents. But his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the true brain behind the throne, stops him. Sokolu is a cold pragmatist. He knows killing Christian taxpayers would destroy the Ottoman economy. Instead of mourning, Sokolu orders work. What happens that winter in the Golden Horn shipyards in Istanbul is an industrial miracle that terrifies Venice. The Ottoman Empire does not weep for lost ships, it replaces them. Sokolu gives an impossible order: build 150 new galleys before spring. Anatolian forests are felled entirely. Metal from mines flows to the capital. Work continues day and night by torchlight. When hemp for ropes runs out, Sokolu orders first-quality linen. When sailcloth is lacking, he orders silk. The empire's power is such, he says, that if necessary, we would make anchors of silver and ropes of silk. Months after total annihilation at Lepanto, Venetian ambassador Marcantonio Barbaro is summoned to the palace. Barbaro enters, expecting to see a humiliated, defeated Grand Vizier begging for peace on his knees. He meets a wall of arrogance. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha looks him in the eye and pronounces one of history's most brutal and geopolitically sharp sentences. "You come to see how we bear our misfortune, but you do not understand the difference between your loss and ours. By taking Cyprus from you, we cut off an arm. By defeating our fleet at Lepanto, you have only shaved our beard. A cut arm does not grow back, but a shaved beard grows back stronger and thicker. The message is devastating. The Holy League won the battle of the century. Yes, they killed 30,000 Turks. Yes, but the Ottoman Empire is a hydra. Cut off one head and two grow." The following spring, barely 6 months after total destruction, a new Ottoman fleet of 200 ships sails the Mediterranean. They shine with fresh paint, have new cannons, seek revenge. The Holy League, by contrast, falls apart, without imminent invasion threat. Old hatreds between Spain and Venice resurface. Don John of Austria wants to attack again, wants to take Tunis, wants to march on Istanbul. But Philip II, the prudent king, clips his wings. There is no money, no political will, the alliance dissolves. Lepanto did not destroy the Ottoman Empire, but it did something perhaps more important, something psychological that changed the world's fate. Before that day, the Turk was considered invincible, a force of nature like an earthquake or plague, something one could only pray against. Lepanto broke the spell. It proved the giant bled. It proved that with enough steel and powder, Islam could be stopped. Yet for one man in particular, the battle never ends. Miguel de Cervantes lies in a Messina hospital. He looks at his left hand, now a useless, twisted stump. His military career is ruined. He can no longer lift a heavy sword or fire an arquebus. He is a cripple in a strange land, penniless and without future. It seems the end of his story. Forgotten soldier among thousands. But that useless hand forces him to seek another weapon. If he cannot hold a sword, he will hold a quill. And while Cervantes recovers, wondering what sense so much sacrifice had, Don John of Austria receives a new mission. A mission far from the sea, in the misty, rainy lands of the north, where the Spanish Empire faces a very different enemy, a place called Flanders. The glory of Lepanto fades fast, and the shadow of death returns to hover over the young hero, because victory has a price, and Don John has not yet paid it all. 7 years after the sea turned red in Greece, the architect of that victory lies dying, but not as an ancient hero surrounded by enemies and glory. He dies in a dirty pigeon loft, full of dung in Flanders, under a grey sky that never stops raining. Don John of Austria, the man sent by God, is 31 and looks like an old man. His body is consumed by typhus. He's delirious with fever, but what really kills him is not the bacteria. It is betrayal by his own blood. His half-brother, King Philip II, never forgave him Lepanto. In the Madrid court, Don John's popularity was poison. People adored him too much. The Pope wanted to crown him king of some conquered territory. For a control-obsessed monarch like Philip, a charismatic bastard brilliant in war is more dangerous than any Turk. So the king gave him a poisoned prize, sent him to govern the Netherlands, the graveyard of Spanish reputation, the Protestant rebels' hornet's nest, where no victory is possible, only eternal attrition. Don John begged to return. He wrote desperate letters asking to be relieved, asking to return to the sea. All letters ignored. The king left him to rot in the mud. On the 1st of October in the year 1578, Don John's heart stops. The conqueror of Islam dies alone and ruined. And then comes the final insult to his body to carry his remains back to Spain. Without alerting French enemies controlling the road, his officers make a macabre decision. They cannot secretly transport an entire coffin, so they cut the hero's body, dismember it. Separate bones from flesh, pack the remains in leather suitcases like contraband goods, and cross France with Europe's savior turned luggage. It is a grotesque end for the man who saved Christendom. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the other protagonist of our story faces an equally cruel fate, born of perverse irony. Miguel de Cervantes, with his useless hand, finally obtains permission to return to Spain. He carries something he believes is his passport to a better life. Letters of recommendation signed by Don John of Austria himself and the Duke of Sessa. They are documents saying, "This man is an elite hero. Treat him with honor." Cervantes boards the galley soul thinking his days of suffering are over. He is wrong. Just off the Catalan coast, almost smelling home, a flotilla of Barbary pirates attacks his ship. He is captured. The pirates chain him and search his belongings and find the letters. Here, luck plays history's heaviest literary joke. Reading the signatures of great generals, the pirates think they have captured a most important noble. A millionaire, someone vital to the King of Spain. They do not see a poor, crippled soldier, they see a sack of money. If Cervantes had not carried those recommendation letters, his ransom would have been cheap and his family would have freed him in weeks. But because of those papers praising his heroism at Lepanto, the pirates set an astronomical price on his head, 500 gold escudos. No one in his family has that money. The letters meant to save him condemn him. Cervantes is dragged to the dungeons of Algiers. He does not know he will spend 5 years there. 5 years of psychological torture, failed escape attempts, and despair. The glory of Lepanto has evaporated. Don John is chopped into suitcases and Cervantes is chained in a Turkish bath. The battle saved Europe, maps say, but to the men who fought it, the battle devoured them. Yet in the darkness of that Algiers prison, Cervantes' mind begins to break and rebuild strangely. Surrounded by madness, cruelty, and failed knights. He begins to gestate an idea about a hidalgo who also believes himself a hero in a world with no place left for heroes. But that is the future, and here only the present exists. And the present is that the Holy League has died and the Mediterranean remains a mass grave. In the end, the Ionian Sea has poor memory. A few weeks after the 7th of October, winter storms cleaned the blood. Sharks and fish finished the work. Artillery began. Rotten wood sank or drifted to distant beaches where no one knew what it meant. If one looks at those waters today, there are no scars. The water is as blue and indifferent as it was the morning before 40,000 men died. And in king's offices, passion cools too. The total war Lepanto promised never came. Spain declared bankruptcy, drowned by army debts. The Ottoman Empire, though it rebuilt its fleet, turned its gaze east toward Persia, tired of smashing against Europe's steel wall. In the year 1580, barely 9 years after the carnage, Philip II and the Sultan sign a truce. A simple paper, a ceasefire. So much hatred, so much fire, so much sacrifice for the border to remain almost in the same place. For cynics, Lepanto was useless. Cyprus was never recovered. The Mediterranean remained infested with pirates. But for those who were there, the account is different. Lepanto conquered no land, but conquered fear. That Sunday afternoon broke the myth of Ottoman invincibility. It was the psychological dam that prevented the Mediterranean from becoming a Turkish lake. It bought time, and in history, time is everything. Miguel de Cervantes is finally ransomed. He returns to Spain after 5 years, captivity, one hand less, and soul full of ghosts. He walks Madrid streets and no one recognizes him. No parades for him. His medals cannot be eaten. He is one more veteran in an empire that quickly forgets its soldiers, but he carries something no one else has. He carries the memory of hell. When he sits at his desk years later, poor and tired, he does not write a war chronicle. He does not write of religious hatreds or naval tactics. He writes of a madman who wants to fix the world with blows. A dreamer who refuses to accept the age of knights has ended. Cervantes lost the ability to use his left hand in history's greatest battle for the greater glory of the right. As he himself would say, the pain of Lepanto, the failure of his military career, and the misery of his captivity distilled into ink. The battle ended. The ships rotted. Empires eventually fell, but in history's darkness, the echo of that day still sounds. Not the cannons, but the human will refusing to surrender to the impossible. In the end, empires are dust and fleets are wood. Only the stories we tell survive about why we decided to fight when all was lost. The sun sets over the Curzolari Islands. The sea is calm, there is no retreat.